Carl Jung believed that one of the most dangerous psychological traps isn't laziness or fear of failure, it's the refusal to be bound by anything at all. He called this the Puer Aeternus, the eternal child. And if you find yourself constantly chasing the next opportunity, the next relationship, the next version of yourself without ever fully committing to any of them, you might be trapped in this archetype right now. The terrifying part? You think you're staying free, but you're actually becoming a prisoner of your own potential. Let's be honest about what this actually looks like in your life. You start projects with explosive enthusiasm, convinced this is finally the thing that will define you, only to abandon them 3 months later when the initial excitement fades. You enter relationships with genuine intention, but the moment things require real work, real sacrifice, real commitment, you find yourself fantasizing about someone else, something else, somewhere else. You've probably changed career paths multiple times, not because you're exploring, but because you're fleeing the moment when things get difficult, when mastery demands repetition, when growth requires you to stay in the fire long enough to be transformed by it. Your friends might call you a free spirit, but deep down, you know the truth feels different. It feels like restlessness. It feels like you're always one step away from your real life beginning, as if you're perpetually in the waiting room of your own existence. You collect experiences, but build nothing. You sample everything, but digest nothing. You're 30, 35, 40 years old, and your life looks like a beautiful mosaic of beginnings with no middles and no ends. The world tells you to follow your passion, to keep your options open, to never settle, and you've followed that advice religiously. So why does it feel like you're starving at a buffet? Why does freedom feel so much like emptiness? This is the Puer Aeternus, and it's not just about immaturity, it's about a fundamental refusal to accept the limitations that make you human. Jung didn't develop this concept in a vacuum. He drew heavily from the work of Marie-Louise von Franz, who wrote extensively about this psychological pattern after observing it repeatedly in her patients. The Puer Aeternus, literally translated as the eternal boy, represents a specific psychological structure where an individual remains identified with youth, potential, and possibility while refusing the descent into the concrete, the limited, and the real. In mythology, this archetype is represented by figures like Peter Pan, Icarus, and the Greek god Dionysus in his younger form, beings who reject the earthly, the mortal, and the bounded. What makes this pattern so insidious is that it masquerades as virtue in our culture. We celebrate the person who refuses to be boxed in, who keeps reinventing themselves, who never stops exploring. But Jung saw something else beneath this celebration. He saw a terror of death, not just physical death, but the death of infinite possibility that occurs every time you make a real choice. Every commitment is a kind of death. When you marry one person, you kill the possibility of marrying anyone else. When you choose one career, you bury 1,000 other potential selves. When you plant roots in one place, you accept that you cannot simultaneously be everywhere. The Puer refuses this death. He wants to keep all possibilities alive, which means he can never fully live any of them. Jung understood that this pattern often has its roots in a specific psychological wound, an insufficiently developed relationship with what he called the father archetype. Not necessarily your biological father, but the principle of structure, limitation, authority, and worldly engagement. The Puer typically had either an absent father or an overly dominant mother, leading to a psyche that never learned to metabolize limitation as creative constraint rather than death sentence. He remains inflated with potential, identified with the spirit realm, the world of pure ideas and possibilities, unable to incarnate into the messy, limited, imperfect material world. Von Franz noted that the Puer often suffers from what she called provisional life syndrome, the feeling that real life hasn't started yet, that you're still in preparation mode, still gathering tools, still waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, years pass. The tragedy is that the Puer often possesses genuine gifts, real talent, authentic vision. But these gifts remain forever potential, forever promise, never actualized into the world. Jung warned that if this pattern isn't confronted, it leads to either a catastrophic breakdown in midlife or a slow crystallization into bitterness, the aging Peter Pan who becomes cynical, seeing himself as too good for the world that refused to recognize his specialness. So how do you break this pattern? How do you commit to life without feeling like you're suffocating your soul? The answer begins with what Jung called the integration of the Senex, the old man, the opposite archetype to the Puer. Where the Puer is all potential and no actuality, the Senex is all structure and crystallization. You need both. The first movement is to consciously choose limitation as a creative act. This isn't about settling or giving up on your dreams. It's about understanding that depth only comes through constraint. A river without banks isn't freedom. It's a swamp. Choose one thing, anything, and commit to it long enough to move past the beginner's excitement into the difficult middle where real transformation happens. This means staying with the relationship past the honeymoon phase, staying with the business past the initial launch energy, staying with the practice past the point where it stops being novel. The magic isn't in the beginning, it's in the staying. The second movement requires you to develop what Jung called a relationship with limitation itself. Start treating your constraints not as problems to overcome, but as the very structure through which your life gains meaning. Your specific body, your specific history, your specific talents and weaknesses. These aren't obstacles to your true self. They are your true self. The Puer wants to be everything, which is another way of being nothing. Maturity means accepting that you are this particular person, in this particular body, in this particular moment, with these particular responsibilities. This acceptance isn't resignation, it's the doorway to authentic power. You must also confront your relationship with failure and imperfection directly. The Puer avoids commitment because commitment means inevitable imperfection. If you never really try, you never really fail. Your potential remains unblemished. But this is a kind of death in life. The path forward requires what Jung called the acceptance of the shadow, the understanding that you will fail, you will be mediocre at times, you will disappoint yourself and others. And this is not only okay, it's necessary. It's the fertilizer for actual growth rather than fantasized perfection. Finally, cultivate a practice of completion. Not perfection, completion. Finish things even when they're not perfect. End relationships consciously rather than ghosting. Close chapters rather than leaving everything perpetually open. The Puer's life is full of ellipses, always trailing off into possibility. Maturity requires periods and paragraph breaks. Each ending creates space for a real beginning rather than another false start. When you practice completion, you begin to build what Jung called psychological substance. You become real, dimensional, present. You trade the intoxication of infinite possibility for the deep satisfaction of actual presence. This is the commitment to life Jung spoke about. Not a cage, but an incarnation. Not a limitation, but a location. Not a death, but a birth into your actual existence. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, or subscribe. It helps this channel grow.